Riz Valentine adjusted his iridescent cravat in the mirror of the Starlight Lounge, a smile playing across his features as he watched the diverse crowd of beings mingling behind him. As the most sought-after matchmaker in 3 galaxies, he had an impressive track record: 27 successful unions between supposedly incompatible species, 15 diplomatic marriages that prevented interstellar wars, and one particularly memorable match between a gas giant inhabitant and a plasma entity that created an entirely new form of stellar life. But tonight, his attention was fixed on something far more intriguing. At the center of the lounge, floating in a containment field of pure energy, was Nexus, a crystalline entity from the Pleiades cluster whose very existence defied conventional understanding of consciousness. "Still admiring your next impossible conquest?" Zara's metallic voice held a note of amusement. The cyborg diplomat's chrome features reflected the ambient starlight as she approached, her quantum core humming with barely contained energy. "My dear Zara," Reese turned, offering his most charming smile. "Nothing is impossible for one who understands the true language of love." "You can't charm a being made of living crystal," she countered, her cybernetic eyes whirring as they focused on him. "Nexus doesn't experience emotions the way organic or even synthetic life forms do. That's exactly what makes it fascinating." Rice produced his signature token, a medallion carved from a meteorite that had allegedly witnessed the birth of the first star. It caught the light, sending prismatic patterns dancing across the lounge's walls. "Every being in existence desires connection, even if they don't recognize it yet." As if hearing its name, Nexus shifted in its containment field, its crystalline structure rearranging into complex geometric patterns that somehow conveyed both curiosity and disdain. The surrounding patrons gasped in appreciation, but Rice saw something deeper, a loneliness in the way the entity's light refracted through the space around it. "Watch and learn," he whispered to Zara, straightening his jacket and approaching the containment field. The medallion spun between his fingers, a trick that had captured the attention of countless beings across the cosmos. "Greetings, most radiant Nexus," he began, his voice pitched to carry just the right note of reverence. "I couldn't help but notice how your presence illuminates our humble establishment." The crystalline entity's response was immediate and unexpected. It transformed into a perfect replica of Rice, complete with spinning medallion, but rendered entirely in translucent crystal. The caricature was both beautiful and somehow mocking. Laughter rippled through the lounge. Even Zara's normally stoic features twisted into an amused smirk, but Riss didn't miss a beat. "Remarkable," he exclaimed, genuine admiration in his voice. "Such perfect mimicry suggests a deep understanding of form and essence. Perhaps we could discuss the philosophical implications over a glass of refined stellar energy." Nexus shifted again, its crystal structure forming complex patterns that the lounge's universal translator struggled to interpret. Finally, it managed. "Your reputation precedes you, Riss Valentine. 27 impossible matches, 15 diplomatic unions, 1 stellar synthesis, yet you understand nothing of true connection." The words should have stung, but Rice felt his smile widening. "Then teach me," he proposed, pocketing his medallion in a rare gesture of sincerity. "If I understand nothing, show me what I'm missing." The crystalline entity pulsed with what might have been surprise or amusement. It was hard to tell with a being whose emotional expressions defied organic comprehension. "You offer to be the student rather than the teacher. This is unexpected." "I'm full of surprises," Reyes replied, winking at a nearby group of admirers who had gathered to watch the exchange. "It's part of my charm." Nexus' response was to suddenly expand its containment field, enveloping Rice in a sphere of pure energy. The lounge erupted in gasps and murmurs as he found himself floating face to face with the crystalline entity, their environments temporarily merged. "Very well, Riss Valentine." Nexus communicated directly into his mind, its thoughts carrying traces of both ancient wisdom and subtle amusement. "Let us see if the greatest matchmaker in 3 galaxies can learn to see beyond the surface of things." As the containment field shimmered around them, Race couldn't help but think he might have finally met his match, in more ways than one. And somewhere in the background, he could have sworn he heard Zora laughing. The game was about to change, and for once, Race Valentine wasn't entirely sure he knew all the rules. But then again, that's what made it exciting. The Starlight Lounge hummed with an entirely different energy the following evening. Rice found himself perched at the Quantum Bar, his usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled after his third failed attempt to engage Nexus in meaningful conversation. His meteorite medallion lay untouched beside his glass of Andromeda wine, its surface somehow duller than usual. "I warned you it wouldn't be easy," Zara reminded him, her chrome features reflecting the pulsing lights of the bar. "Crystalline entities don't respond to traditional forms of courtship." "Traditional?" Rice scoffed, running a hand through his normally perfect hair. "I tried communicating through quantum harmonics. I arranged for a stellar wind serenade. I even attempted to match its crystalline structure with a holographic display. And each time, it transformed your gestures into increasingly creative caricatures of yourself," a new voice observed. Both Rice and Zara turned to find a striking figure sliding onto the barstool beside them. The newcomer appeared to be constantly shifting, her form flowing like liquid mercury, while maintaining a vaguely humanoid shape. Her eyes, when they settled into any particular form, held the depth of ancient nebulae. "Venna," she introduced herself, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of space-time. "Shapeshifter, wanderer, and occasional observer of romantic disasters." "I don't recall asking for commentary," Reyes muttered, though he couldn't help being intrigued by her fluid nature. "Unless you're offering advice." Venna laughed, the sound rippling through her mercury-like form. "Oh, I wouldn't dare instruct the great Race Valentine in matters of the heart. Though I must say, watching you try to seduce a being of pure crystal consciousness has been the highlight of my stellar cycle." Before Race could formulate a suitably witty response, a familiar energy field expanded through the lounge. Nexus had emerged from its private chamber, its crystalline structure casting rainbow refractions across the gathered crowd. To Rice's dismay, it immediately began a perfect reenactment of his failed stellar wind serenade, complete with his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his dignity. "Fascinating," Venna observed, her form shifting to better observe the performance. "It's not just mocking you. It's trying to show you something." "Yes, that I'm making a fool of myself." Reyes reached for his medallion, but Zara's chrome hand stopped him. "No more props," the cyborg diplomat advised. "Look closer at what Nexus is actually doing." Rice forced himself to watch as the crystalline entity continued its recreation. With each gesture, each movement, Nexus wasn't just showing his actions, it was revealing the layers of pretense behind them, the carefully constructed facade he built over years of professional matchmaking. "It sees through you," Venna noted, her form settling into something that reminded Rice of starlight on water. "Every practiced smile, every calculated charm. You've spent so long creating perfect matches for others, you've forgotten how to be genuine yourself." "I am genuine," Riz protested, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. "Everything I do is in service of creating true connections." Nexus paused its performance, its crystalline structure realigning to face their small group. Through the lounge's universal translator, its message came through with crystal clarity. "You understand the mechanics of love, Riz Valentine, but not its essence. You orchestrate connections without truly experiencing them yourself." The words hit harder than any rejection he'd faced in his illustrious career. Rice found himself standing, his carefully maintained composure cracking. "And what would you know of experiencing love? You're a being of pure crystal and energy." The lounge fell silent. Even Venna's fluid form stilled, her nebula eyes wide with surprise at his outburst. Nexus' response was to simply fade its luminescence until its crystal structure was nearly transparent, revealing at its core a pattern of light that pulsed with an almost heartbreaking beauty. "More than you might think," Zara translated softly, her cybernetic systems detecting nuances in the light pattern that others missed. "It's showing you its heart." Rez sank back onto his barstool, the weight of his own prejudices and assumptions crashing down around him. He'd been so convinced he could charm any being in existence, he'd never stopped to question whether his approach to love itself might be fundamentally flawed. "Well," Venice said into the silence, her form rippling with something that might have been sympathy, "I believe this is what humans call the teachable moment." Indeed, Nexus communicated, its crystal structure brightening again. "The question is, Riss Valentine, are you truly ready to learn?" Looking between the shapeshifter's knowing gaze, the cyborg's quiet understanding, and the crystalline entity's patient radiance, Rice felt something shift inside him. For the first time in his career as the galaxy's greatest matchmaker, he realized he might be the one who needed matching, not with another being, but with his own authentic self. "I suppose," he said finally, leaving his medallion untouched on the bar, "that depends on whether you're willing to teach." Nexus's response was to create a small crystal that perfectly matched the rhythm of Rise's heartbeat, offering it to him like a key to an entirely new understanding of connection. And somewhere in the depths of space, the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The crystal nexus had given Rise pulse gently against his chest, synchronized perfectly with his heartbeat as he sat in one of the Starlight Lounge's quieter corners. The morning crowd was sparse, mostly consisting of beings whose species didn't require sleep or who operated on entirely different circadian rhythms. "You look terrible," Naomi declared, sliding into the seat across from him. The Earth emissary's dark eyes sparkled with amusement as she took in his uncharacteristically rumpled appearance. "I heard about last night's performance." "News travels fast," Riz muttered, absently touching the crystal pendant. "I don't suppose you're here to offer sympathy." Actually, she leaned forward, her braids catching the artificial starlight. "I'm here because Zara thought you might need a different perspective. Someone a bit more organic." Before Race could respond, Vena materialized beside their table, her mercury-like form settling into something approximating a seated position. "More organic than a shapeshifter, you mean? More organic than a cyborg diplomat or a crystalline entity," Naomi corrected with a smile. "Though I suspect we all have something to teach our illustrious matchmaker." Rez looked between them, noting how Vena's fluid form seemed to unconsciously mirror Naomi's posture. "I've made countless successful matches across species, cultures, and even states of matter. What could you possibly teach me that I don't already know?" "Perhaps," Vena's form rippled thoughtfully, "how to fail gracefully. Or how to be genuine," Naomi added. "I am genuine," Rez protested, but the crystal at his chest pulsed more rapidly, betraying his agitation. Both women glanced at it, then at each other, sharing knowing looks that made him distinctly uncomfortable. "Tell me," Naomi said carefully, "in all your successful matches, how many times have you actually been in love yourself?" The question caught him off guard. "That's not relevant to my work." "Isn't it?" Vena's form shifted to catch the light in a way that reminded him eerily of Nexus. "How can you guide others to true connection when you've never experienced it yourself?" "I've experienced plenty of connections." Rez reached for his medallion before remembering he'd left it at the bar. The absence of his usual prop made him feel strangely vulnerable. "Superficial ones," Naomi noted gently. "Brief encounters that never challenged you to grow or change. You're like a chef who's memorized recipes but never tasted the food." The crystal pulsed warmly against his chest, as if agreeing with her assessment. Rice found himself wondering if Nexus was somehow watching, learning about him through this gift it had given him. "What Nexus sees in you," Vena said, as if reading his thoughts, "is potential. But potential means nothing without the willingness to be transformed by it." "Transformed?" Riz laughed weakly. "I'm not the one who can change shape at will." "No," Naomi reached across the table to touch his hand. "You're the one who needs to change on the inside." As if on cue, Nexus itself appeared, its crystalline structure casting prismatic patterns across their small gathering. Instead of its usual mimicry, it simply observed, its energy field humming with what might have been approval. "You've spent your career creating perfect matches," Venna observed, her form becoming more defined as she spoke. "But perfection isn't the same as authenticity. Look at us," Naomi gestured to their unlikely group. "A human diplomat, a shapeshifter, a cyborg, and a crystalline entity. None of us are perfect, but every connection we form is real." The crystal at Rise's chest warmed significantly, and he realized with a start that its pulse had synchronized not just with his heartbeat, but with the subtle energy signatures of everyone at the table. Even Nex's crystalline structure seemed to resonate with the shared rhythm. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted finally, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I don't know how to be imperfect. That," Nexus communicated through its energy field, "is the most genuine thing you've said since we met." Venna's form rippled with approval. "Admitting what you don't know is the first step to learning. And learning," Naomi squeezed his hand, "is the first step to real connection." As the crystal continued its gentle pulsing, creating a harmony between their disparate forms of existence, Rice felt something shift inside him. The carefully constructed walls of his professional persona began to crack, letting in possibilities he never allowed himself to consider. "So," he said softly, looking at each of his unlikely teachers in turn, "where do we begin?" Nexus' response was to create a small display of crystalline figures, each representing one of them. As they watched, the figures began to dance together, not in the perfect choreography Riss would have once attempted to orchestrate, but in a beautiful, chaotic pattern that somehow worked precisely because of its imperfections. "We begin," Venna translated, her form flowing like stardust, "by learning to dance to a different rhythm." And for the first time in his life, Riss Valentine, the galaxy's most renowned matchmaker, found himself ready to follow instead of lead. The observation deck of the Starlight Lounge offered a breathtaking view of the local star cluster, but Riss barely noticed it. His attention was fixed on the crystal pendant that had become both his teacher and his tormentor over the past few days. Each pulse seemed to echo with lessons he was only beginning to understand. "You're brooding again," Venna observed, her mercury-like form flowing into existence beside him. "It's becoming quite the habit." "I prefer to think of it as deep reflection," Rice replied, though a smile tugged at his lips. The shapeshifter's presence had become oddly comforting, perhaps because she never pretended to be anything other than exactly what she was. "Then reflect on this." She shifted to mirror his posture perfectly, even mimicking the way he held the crystal. "Why are you really here?" "Because Nexus." "No," she interrupted, her form rippling with frustration. "Why are you really here? What drives the great Riss Valentine to chase impossible connections across the cosmos?" The crystal pulsed sharply against his chest, almost like a warning. Before he could formulate a response, Zora's metallic footsteps announced her arrival. "He's afraid," the cyborg diplomat stated matter-of-factly, her quantum core humming softly. "Afraid of forming real connections because real connections can fail." "I'm not afraid," Riss protested, but the crystal's rhythm betrayed him again, quickening like a caught lie. "I've made more successful matches than anyone in 3 galaxies." "Yes," Naomi's voice joined them as she emerged from the shadows. "You've made matches for everyone else, created perfect connections for others, while keeping yourself safely distant from the possibility of failure." Rice turned to face his growing audience, finding Nexus hovering silently behind them, its crystalline structure refracting their images in endless recursive patterns. Each reflection seemed to show a different facet of himself he'd been trying to ignore. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, frustration seeping into his voice. "I've stopped using my tricks. I've listened to your lessons. I've tried to be genuine." "Tried," Venna emphasized, her form becoming more abstract as she spoke. "But you're still performing, still calculating every response. Even now, you're thinking about how to turn this moment to your advantage." The crystal grew warm against his skin, and suddenly Race found himself enveloped in Nexus's energy field. But this time, instead of the gentle observation he'd grown accustomed to, he was bombarded with images, every superficial connection he'd ever made, every heart he'd touched without truly engaging, every perfect match he'd orchestrated while keeping his own heart locked safely away. "Stop," he whispered, but the images continued. He saw himself through Nexus's crystalline perspective, a brilliant but hollow being, reflecting love without truly understanding it. "You want to know why Nexus chose to teach you?" Zara asked softly, her cybernetic eyes whirring as they focused on him. "Because it saw what you could become if you stopped being afraid of your own heart." "I'm not afraid," Rise repeated, but his voice cracked. The crystal pulsed in sync with his racing heart, creating a symphony of denial and desperate longing. "Then prove it," Naomi challenged. "Show us who Riss Valentine really is, beneath all the perfect matches and calculated charms." He faltered, looking between his unlikely circle of friends. Venna's fluid form seemed to reach for him in sympathy, while Zora's chrome features softened with understanding. Naomi's dark eyes held no judgment, only patient encouragement. And Nexus. The Starlight Lounge was more crowded than usual. Beings from across the cosmos gathered for what they'd heard would be a historic moment. The famous matchmaker Rice Valentine was about to give his first public address since his mysterious encounters with the crystalline entity began. Riss stood at the center of the observation deck, the crystal pendant pulsing steadily against his chest. Gone were his elaborate outfits and practiced poses. Even his legendary Mickey-Rit medallion remained where he'd left it, gathering dust on the quantum bar. "You don't have to do this," Naomi murmured, standing supportively at his side. "No one would blame you for keeping some things private." "Yes, I do," he replied softly, watching as Venna flowed through the crowd, her mercury-like form rippling with excitement. Zara had positioned herself near the back, her cybernetic systems monitoring the room's energy patterns. And Nexus. Nexus hovered above them all, its crystalline structure casting rainbow patterns across the gathered audience. "Friends," Reyes began, his voice carrying none of its usual artificial charm. "For years, I've been known as the galaxy's greatest matchmaker. I've created connections between beings who seemed impossibly different. I've prevented wars through carefully orchestrated romances. I've even helped create new forms of life through unlikely unions." The crystal pulsed warmly, encouraging him to continue. "But I've been a fraud." The words rang out across the suddenly silent lounge. "Not in my matches. Those were all genuine. But in my understanding of what real connection means." Venna's form stilled, reflecting the starlight in a way that made her look like a constellation given life. Zara's quantum core hummed in harmony with the crystal's pulse. "I thought love was something you could orchestrate, like a perfect dance or a diplomatic treaty. I believed connection could be reduced to a formula. The right words, the right gestures, the right moments carefully calculated for maximum effect." He touched the crystal, drawing strength from its steady rhythm. "I was wrong. Real connection, true love, isn't about perfection. It's about being brave enough to be imperfect together." Nexus descended slowly, its energy field expanding to encompass him. But this time, instead of showing him his flaws, it revealed the beauty of his transformation, every crack in his facade now filled with light. "Look at us," he gestured to his unlikely circle of friends, "a human diplomat who taught me the power of simple truth, a shape-shifter who showed me that identity isn't fixed, a cyborg who proved that emotion transcends form, and a crystalline entity who saw through every layer of pretense to the heart of who I could become." The crystal's pulse synchronized with Nexus's energy field, creating a harmony that resonated through the entire lounge. Beings of all forms and origins swayed slightly, feeling the connection that transcended physical boundaries. "I thought I was pursuing Nexus," Rice continued, a genuine smile replacing his practiced one. "I thought I could add a crystalline entity to my list of impossible conquests. Instead, I found something far more valuable. I found myself. Vena flowed forward, her form taking on aspects of everyone present. Human, crystal, chrome, and energy, all swirling together in a beautiful chaos. "Show them," she encouraged. Riz nodded, reaching for the crystal. As his fingers touched its surface, Nexus's energy field intensified, and suddenly every being in the lounge could see what he had learned. That love wasn't about perfect matches or calculated gestures. It was about the courage to be seen, truly seen, and to see others in return. "I'm no longer in the business of making perfect matches," he announced. "Instead, I want to help beings find their authentic connections, to discover the beauty in their differences, to learn that love isn't about changing who you are, but about finding those who celebrate you exactly as you are." The crystal flared brilliantly, and in its light, every being in the lounge saw themselves reflected not as they pretended to be, but as they truly were. The effect was stunning. A moment of pure, shared authenticity that transcended all barriers. "So," Race concluded, looking at each of his teachers in turn, "this isn't an ending. It's not about winning or losing, about conquering or being conquered. It's about beginning again, with truth as our foundation and authenticity as our guide." Nexus descended completely, its crystalline structure touching down beside him. Through their shared connection, its message reached everyone present. "And that, Riz Valentine, is the greatest match you've ever made. The one between your outer self and your inner truth." The crystal pulsed one final time. And in that moment, every being in the Starlight Lounge understood what Rise had learned. That love, real love, exists beyond the surface of things, in the space where courage meets vulnerability and perfection gives way to truth. As the applause erupted around him, Rice caught Naomi's proud smile, saw Zura's quantum core glowing with approval, felt Vena's fluid form brush against him in celebration. But most importantly, he felt at peace with himself, finally understanding that the greatest romance wasn't about conquering the impossible, but about having the courage to be genuinely, imperfectly real. And somewhere in the cosmos, a story began to spread, not about the matchmaker who could charm any being in existence, but about the man who learned that true love begins with the heart's own truth.